and I'll tell you how we'll do the interactive bit later. We're just going to start with a few slides. Let me minimize this. So today we're talking about where are we going with transfusions and what's happening, not necessarily right now, but what's kind of on the way. What can we see coming down the line, and in terms of especially about improving transfusions. And I thought it might be good to start with this really exciting piece of news that came out a couple of weeks ago that a lot of you might have seen in the news about lab-grown blood that's given to people in a world first clinical trial. And interestingly, I've heard through other means, other patients talking about it, and I want to explain how it works, explain why it's important and why it's exciting, but also I
This
don't
way,
want to.
Bobby.
Oh, can we mute? If can you guys mute if you're not talking? Um, Also be realistic about when things are going to change, because I don't like it when there's too much hype and people start to imagine that everything's going to change tomorrow, because it doesn't feel fair to people living with these conditions if you think that things are going to change very quickly, because unfortunately these things take a lot longer than we would all like. So today what we'll cover, first I'm going to start with what is this piece of news from November 7th, what's it all about. I'm going to step back from it and talk about why it's important. I'm going to then move forwards and talk about what's happening now in clinical trials, but what's coming in the future, and then we'll move on to Matt about how can we improve how current transfusions are used. And one of the really exciting things I find about research is that it's not all one thing. So you've got different people studying lots of different things at the same time, and some of it feels a little bit like a competition. So we might talk about this new thing with the lab cells that are grown with the blood cells that are grown in the lab, and then Matt's going to talk about how can we improve how transfusions are managed using current blood, and maybe one of these techniques will turn out to win over the other, but we don't know which one's going to work. We don't know what's going to come out top, and this is great that lots of different pieces of research are happening, because we can't sort of second guess what's going to be the best option. And of course, there may be lots of different options in the future. So I'm going to send this I can send the slides to Roanna to send to everybody if they want. And I've put in yellow here, there's a YouTube video from the people who've done this trial that explains a little bit more detail about how they've done it. So if anybody's interested, you could look at the YouTube film as well. And what was reported in the news is something from the Restore clinical trial. So when you have a clinical trial, and this is true of Matt's work as well, people try and come up with like a clever name that everyone's going to remember. And this name, they use the sort of these capital letters, and they try and make it all work so that you will remember that it's called the Restore trial, but actually Restore stands for something that's meaningful for the trial. So Restore stands for recovery and survival of stem cell originated red cells. So what does this mean? It means that, I don't know if people can mute, because I can still hear some people. Okay, if you can mute, if you've got your microphone on. So what does this mean? It means that this clinical trial is making red blood cells out of stem cells, and I'm going to explain how that works. And they want to see whether these red cells survive in the bloodstream and for how long. Okay, so that's all the clinical trial is trying to do. They're not trying to improve the lives of people with thalassemia. They're not trying to, change the outcomes. They're just saying, let's see if these brand new red blood cells that have been grown in a lab actually survive in the bloodstream and how long they survive. So whenever you have a clinical trial, you've got some people who are in charge. So these are the two people, Professor Cedric Gavert and Dr. Rebecca Cardigan. The sponsor is the people who are basically taking overall responsibility for the whole trial. So that's NHS Blood and Transplant, NHSBT. So these are people who run all the blood units in the UK. then somebody's funding it. So this is both NHSBT Research Governance Committee and the NIHR BTRU grant. So that's just different pieces of funding. And this is just the sort of theme that it comes under. So I've put the summary here and I've highlighted the keywords. So it's a single center study, which means that this is not being done in lots of different places. It's being done in one place. It's randomized. So the people who are taking part will receive one treatment or another. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail. Controlled phase 1. So I'm going to talk about the phases of a clinical trial, but a phase 1 trial is like the very first part of a clinical trial that's done in humans, okay? Which means that all the lab work has been done, any animal work has been done, but this is the first time that they're giving a product, can be a medication, in this case it's these blood cells, in humans. So we're not doing this in patients, this is being done in healthy volunteers. And a phase 1 trial is always done in healthy volunteers. These are people who volunteer, they do get paid, and they volunteer to be given medications, and it's usually to see how safe something is, okay? And it's a crossover trial. A crossover trial means that our healthy volunteers are going to be randomly put into 2 different groups. One group is going to get normal blood transfusion red cells, and the other group is going to get these new red cells that have been grown in the lab. And then they're going to cross over so that the next time they get given the opposite thing. So the ones who started off with the new red cells from the lab will now have normal red cells from a transfusion, and the other way around. And what they're looking at is how many of these new red cells survive in the bloodstream of healthy volunteers. And we're not talking a bag of transfusions, okay? These people are not receiving a bag of transfusion like you guys. They are receiving a mini dose, a tiny little bit of these red blood cells. And where do these red blood cells come from? They come from adult blood that has the stem cells pulled out. So this CD34, what does it mean? All of our blood, well, all of our cells in our body actually have different markers on them, and those markers kind of tell us what kind of cell it is. So if you wanted to look at a skin cell and you wanted to look at a heart cell, look at them under the microscope and you would say, well, this is what a skin cell looks like and this is what a heart cell looks like. So you could do it from like with your eyes. You could look at it under the microscope with your eyes, or you could look for what's on the surface of these cells, and that's what's called the markers. And the marker for stem cells in the blood is called CD34. Okay, so what they're doing is they're taking, like, if you took my blood today, you could pull out of my blood CD34 cells. So those are cells that can grow to turn into blood cells. And that's how they grow the cells in the lab. And I'm going to go into more detail about that later. And they're comparing it to just normal red blood cells that are being donated that you get through NHSBT. Okay, so that's what we're focusing on. So I wanted to discuss how do red blood cells develop. And I want to start with the bone marrow. So on the top, I've got on the right this beautiful picture of, it's called an erythroblastic island. It's how red blood cells grow in a normal bone marrow. In the middle, this thing is called a macrophage. It's also called a nurse cell, which I think is a lovely name for it. You can imagine this big fat cell in the middle that's feeding all these baby cells all around it. So it's a nurse cell, a macrophage, and it's feeding all these developing red blood cells that are growing up all around it, like a nursery. And around this, you have these hematopoietic stem cells. So these are the ones I was talking about that have this marker called CD34. It's very boring, but the scientific way of describing these markers is all these numbers: CD1, CD2, CD3, CD, etc. Okay, that's just the way that they've been named. And these can then develop into mature cells. So some of these CD34 cells will actually develop into white blood cells, and some of them will actually develop into platelets, but we're not interested in that today. Today, we're just interested in the ones that develop into red blood cells. And all these fancy names here at the top are really irrelevant for today. What you need to sort of look at is how these cells become, how they change shape and they become more and more mature. And do you see how the color changes over time? So they're blue for a long, long time, they're blue. And then near the end of their life in the bone marrow, they become purple and then they become pink. And that's because they make hemoglobin. Okay, so when they're very immature, they don't make hemoglobin. And as they get more and more mature, they make more and more hemoglobin until they're bright pink red blood cells. And then you've got these retics, which a lot of you might have heard of. Those are basically the last stage before they're fully mature red cells. And if you don't have thalassemia, you can have retics in your bloodstream. So if you were to check my blood, I would have maybe 1% of my cells would be retics. Somebody who's got sickle cell, so some of you will know about sickle cell disease as well, they have a problem where their red blood cells are being destroyed all the time. So actually their retic count will be high because they're forever trying to overcome the problem that their red blood cells are being destroyed. In thalassemia, there's a problem that kind of develops along this maturation pathway. And because of not having the right genes to make the right hemoglobin, the cells try and mature, but then they just die off. And so the retic count is actually low, okay? So this is what happens in the bone marrow. It's all happening around a nurse cell. I've drawn it out like a linear process here with the arrow just to show you the sequence of events, but it's happening around these nurse cells. If we take these very early CD34 cells from a blood donor, we can actually grow them in the lab. So that's what the bottom half is. We grow them, it's always this pink liquid that we grow them in, and we put different amounts of different chemicals in there. I call them chemicals, they're called cytokines. They're basically like growth factors. And what they do is they help the cells to mature and turn into mature red blood cells, okay? So for example, you might think, well, what kinds of things would you put in there? Well, for example, you would put iron in there, right? Because everybody knows that we need iron to make red blood cells. So you would put iron in, but there's lots of different types of things that get put in there. And these are real pictures of cells that have been grown in the lab. And essentially, it means that in a lab, we can copy what's happening in the bone marrow. We can start off with these cells, these hematopoietic stem cells, these CD34 cells, and we can turn them into red blood cells. It's really amazing. And we do this quite often in the lab to study. We usually don't do it to transfuse, okay? We just grow them to study different conditions. So for example, one of the conditions I study is called CDA type 1, congenital dyserythropoietic anemia type 1. And we grow these cells in the lab all the time so that we can do tests and we don't have to ask patients for lots of samples. We can just say, oh, right, well, I'm going to test this. I'm going to see if I can make it get better by trying this chemical instead or whatever. So we do these experiments in the lab. But the difference here is that what NHSBT and what this clinical trial have done is they're growing them to then use them for transfusions, which is completely amazing. So go back to this clinical trial. What are they trying to do? Whenever you do science, you've got to have a hypothesis. You've got to have an idea that you're going to try and prove true or false. And so their hypothesis is that these red blood cells that they've grown in the lab, they think will survive longer in the circulation of the volunteers than the standard donated red cells. Okay, I'm not going to go through the study design again because I've already explained it, single study, crossover, blah, blah, blah. But what they want to test is, do these red blood cells that are grown in the lab survive longer in the bloodstream? What about this piece of news from November 7th? If you read that in the news, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this is it, it's working, it's going to be available, we can all have this tomorrow. And this is where I want to, really make sure to be realistic with everybody, because what this piece of news reported is that 2 people have been transfused with these lab-grown red blood cells, okay? How much transfusion did they receive? 5 to 10 mils. a teaspoon. Okay, they've been given a teaspoon of red blood cells. Half of them got normal blood donor red blood cells, and half of them got these red blood cells that were grown in the lab. They made sure that that these two people were healthy, that they didn't have some horrible reaction to these small amounts of red cells. They checked that their that they didn't have any side effects, etc. At the moment, the two people who have these transfusions, they don't know if they've had well, let's say we know one of them had had donor red blood cells, like from a normal bag, and the other one had the lab grown red blood cells. We know one had each. There's one of each who had one patient had one of each. But neither the patients nor the doctors looking after them know which patient had which. Okay, so that is what we mean when we say the trial is blinded. And the reason why we do these blinded trials is because we don't want to influence the results. We don't want, if it wasn't blinded, you could imagine a situation where somebody's received the new red blood cells that were grown in the lab, and they keep thinking about the fact, oh my God, these were grown in a lab. They're not actually from a human. I mean, they were started off with human cells, but they put all these chemicals in. Oh, and then they start to feel unwell and think, oh, I really don't feel very good. But that might all be due to the fact that they're aware of the fact that these are lab grown red blood cells. So that's why it's blinded, so that the patients don't know, and the nurses giving them, and the doctors in charge of them, nobody knows what they've had. And nobody will know until the trial is finished, and then they will analyze the results, and then they will tell people. Okay, so where are we now? At least 10 people need to do this. So 2 have done it, so 8 people need to go next. And what they're doing is they're having 2 mini transfusions at least 4 months apart. So whatever they've received in 4 months, they get the opposite. Okay, now obviously somebody needs to know who had what, otherwise you wouldn't be able to give the opposite thing to the other to each person. So the trial is not completely blind, because somebody does know, so that they can send the right vial to the unit where they're giving it. But the people who know who's having what, they're not involved in speaking to the patients or analyzing the results or anything. So once everybody's had all their transfusions and they've they analyze the data, they unblind it, and they analyze the data, and then they're going to compare how long the red cells survived in the people who had, well, because everybody's going to have had everything, but for each of the transfusions they had, they're going to see how long each of the red cells survived. Okay, so then what will happen once that's done is, let's assume that the hypothesis is correct and that they say, yes, we were right. The people who had the lab grown red blood cells, these red blood cells stayed in the bloodstream for 2 or 3 months, let's say, compared to 1 month for the people who had the normal blood. Does that mean we can just give this blood to everybody? No, we then need bigger clinical trials. And I'm going to explain how that's going to work. So I'm not trying to put a damper on things, but I just want to be clear that we're very early in this process. So lots of work has happened already in the lab. They've done all the scientific work. They've done any animal work, etc. This is an exciting result that this is happening. But then there's a lot of work to come before we can start to give this to oops. Okay. So I wanted to step a little bit back and say, why is this important? Now, the main reason, there's different reasons for doing this trial, and the main reason is specifically for the people that are very hard to transfuse. And I'm going to explain, maybe some of you know already why there's people that are hard to transfuse, but for those of you who don't know yet, I'm going to explain it. So when we say we're going to match some blood, what do we mean? So we usually mean we're going to match the A and the B and the RHD antigens. Okay, so the word antigen just means a marker on the blood cell. Remember I said that a lot of the markers are called CD1, CD2, CD whatever, 34. These are like the same. So an A antigen, it will have another name, CD something or other, and B antigen is going to have another CD something or other. So for example, I'm B positive, so I would not have an A antigen, I would have a B antigen, and I would have an RHD antigen. Okay, but if somebody is like O negative, they would not have an A antigen, they would not have a B antigen, and they would not have the RHD antigen. Okay, so that's how we divide up all the different blood groups. But it's very misleading to think that those are all the blood groups, because in actual fact, we've got tons of blood groups. We've got probably about 200 blood groups. Okay, so we've got the ABO. Oops. We've got the ABO. We've got the D, which is also this other name, Rh antigen. But there's also these others, big C, big E, little e, Cal, JS, Duffy, all of these, okay? But let me go to the next slide. So if we've got two people who are both A positive, so I've drawn this with all the blood groups. This first person is A positive and this second person is A positive. What do we mean by that? They've definitely got the A, they definitely don't have the B, and they definitely have the big D, okay? They look the same, but in actual fact, you could have someone who doesn't have the big C and has the little c, and doesn't have the big E and have the little e. They would still be called A positive. And this person on the right, who does have the big C but doesn't have the little c, and who does have the big E and doesn't have the little e, they're also called A positive. Okay, so now you can see how actually, although when we say somebody's A positive, that's just a very superficial look at their blood group, and that we can gather a lot more information about more specifically what blood group they have. And if we gave the blood from this person on the right, if that was a blood donor, and we gave it to the person on the left, who's a recipient, even though they're both A positive, the recipient could make some antibodies. They could make an anti-big C because they don't have a big C, and they would have been given it in the transfusion. And they would make an anti-big E because they don't have the big E, and they would have received it. Okay, so the more antibodies people develop, the harder they are. The harder it is to find somebody who's exactly the same blood group. That means that they can safely be given the blood. So I've just done a little example where I've imagined somebody who's not got the big E, not got the big C, but also doesn't have JKA and doesn't have big M and doesn't have the big S. So that person could make all these antibodies. And what you can be in a situation, and I'm not saying I could have looked this up, but maybe there's only like 1 in 10,000 people who would match this phenotype. So it becomes really harder and harder and harder to find blood for people who have a lot of antibodies because there's not many donors who have it. So how does this relate to this clinical trial? Well, actually, at the moment, when we receive blood donors that just kind of walk in through the doors of NHSBT, they've got random blood types, right? We don't go out in the street saying, is there anybody here who's got A positive but no big E, little c, blah, blah, blah. It's just whatever happens to walk in through the door. Whereas if we can suddenly pick specific donors that have specific blood groups and grow them in a lab, that will be amazing. That would mean that we could have blood for all sorts of different types of really rare blood groups or really hard to transfuse people, and we can control those specific types. Okay, now we can get onto this the Q&A, but there's also a separate project that is working to do the super detailed typing of all the blood donors that come through NHSBT, because at the moment we don't even know what blood groups people have beyond the ABO and a little bit more. Okay, so there's a piece of work that needs to be done for that. Secondly, you will all know that transfused cells don't last very long, right? So if you look at my blood, my bone marrow, when it makes red blood cells, the blood cells that come out will into my bloodstream will last 120 days. So you would kind of think that if I gave blood, then a transfused unit would last 120 days, but you know that's not true, right? You know that when you have a blood transfusion, you basically need one every month. And so Braxa that was saying earlier, she's going every 2 weeks. So some people don't even last even a month. They have to have transfusions a lot more frequently than that. So I'm gonna try and explain why that is. So we're back to our diagram of red blood cells. So if you take a unit of blood from me, you'll be getting some red blood cells that have been in my bloodstream for a long time, like up to 120 days, and you'll be getting some of the blood cells that have just been made in the last 24 hours. Whereas if you can grow all these cells in the lab, they're all growing at the same time. So actually, all of your blood cells in the lab should be young red blood cells. Okay, and I've tried to draw it on this diagram. So this is a blood unit that came from a donor. A donor's bone marrow will make blood cells that will survive 120 days. But if you think about the blood that's been taken from their arm, some of those red cells will actually be 119 days old, and they're only going to survive 1 day. And some of them will be 118 days old, and some will be 117 days old, etc., all the way down to some cells that will be 1 day old. And so they should survive 119 days. Okay, but unfortunately, that's only a small proportion of them. Whereas the ones we grow in the lab, because they're all growing together at the same time and we're controlling their growth, all of the cells should survive 119 days. Now, for people with thalassemia and other other transfusion-dependent anemias, that's a game changer, right? Imagine if you just needed a transfusion every 3 months instead of every month. That would be massive improvement in terms of how you feel and how often you need to come and how much chelation you need. So that's our second reason. And then finally, the third reason is we can control the production. So when we have people coming in through the door, we've got to do this stock management, okay? And the horrible thing about stock management, and I always feel bad explaining this, especially if people haven't realized this. Let's say that you're getting some milk in from some farmers, and you're selling your milk. You want to make sure that you've got milk available all the time. So you can't say to people, oh, well, today I haven't got any milk, so you can't have any. So you have to make sure there's always milk available. So the way you would manage your milk stock is you would put in your, let's say you have a little store, you would put the old milk at the front of the fridge, and then the new milk that just came in today, you're not going to put it for people to buy. You're going to keep it and put it at the back of the fridge. So people will always be picking up the oldest milk, because that way you don't waste anything. But that means that you're forever holding the new milk, the freshest milk, and getting people to buy the old milk. I don't mean old as in like expired, right? I just mean it's still good, but it's just been in your fridge for 2 weeks or whatever. And the same thing happens with blood. We can't, if we were always using the freshest blood, then the less fresh blood would keep wasting because it would go out of date. So we would have to throw it away. So it's there's a lot of wastage. So we're always giving out the oldest red cells. Now, this is not true for people who've got thalassemia or other transfusion-dependent anemias, because as much as we can, we give young red cells. And a lot of you, those of you who know me, you'll have heard me speak about this. We give you the biggest bags and we give you the youngest red cells. But those youngest red cells are still, we say up to 10 days old, right? So we're getting back to our issue of how long the cells are going to survive. But anyways, if we could control which cells are growing and how much they're growing and how often, then suddenly we don't have wastage and we don't have old blood. We're using fresh cells all the time, and we're controlling our stocks. Right. Just checking the time. So I'm going to step forward a little bit about the future. So I did.
Hi, Noemi. Sorry to interrupt. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Do you want to do it at the end, or
can you go ahead and ask me?
So Bob has asked, how can you detect the transfused cells after they've been circulating for 2 or 3 months? And you can't. And there's a follow-up question: can you engineer lab red blood cells so they are negative for every antigen?
Okay, so how they do the detection? So they there's different ways of detecting it, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know which way they're using at the moment for this trial. I haven't seen like the details, but you can sometimes the engineered ones might include something that might be a little bit fluorescent, or they would include something that it can be detected. You know, those markers I was talking about, the CD34 or whatever, they can use one of those markers that's specific to the donor, so that if you, okay, let me go back. Maybe it would be easier to explain. So let's say that they're giving blood to a recipient who doesn't have the big K, but the donor cell does have the big K. They can pick it up in the flow cytometry. So that means they run the blood. So once you've received your transfusion, they check you again after a week, a month, 2 months, 3 months, and they run it through this machine that kind of lights up for each of these. And they would say there's you know, at the beginning there's like 10,000 cells that have the big K, and then a week later there's 9,000 cells, and then a month later there's 8,000 cells, and then 2 months later there's still 7,000 cells. And if they do that with your blood from a bag, they can also pick a donor that also has the big K or not. I mean, it's not the big, it won't be the big K, because those are things you would make antibodies against, but it's one of the markers that are not going to be problematic for the patient, but that you're going to be able to pick up as something that lights up differently in the test. Okay, so that's the first question. What was the second question? Oh, can you do blood that's negative for everything? No, you can't actually. That's a really, really good question. And the reason for that is a little bit hard to explain, but some of these blood tests, some of these blood antigens, these things are one or another. So for example, I'm probably not going to be very good at explaining this, but you can't be, let me see if I can think of an analogy. You can't be negative for, if you're negative for JK, you have to be positive for JKB. If you're negative for JKB, you have to be positive for JKA. It's because of the way that these antibodies are these antigens, sorry, are different versions of the same thing. Now, some people are completely negative for some of these, but there is not possible to be negative for everything, because in a way you wouldn't be a red cell if you were negative for everything. To be a red cell, you need to have some of these things on your surface. Otherwise, you can't have the function of a red cell, because these markers are not just, they look like decorations, right? They look like things that are just sitting there, little flags going, this is what I'm doing. But actually, they have a function in the red cell. So some of them will be moving salts in and out of the red blood cell. So if you were saying, right, I want a red cell that's negative for that antigen, well, then you have no way to move salt in and out. Okay, so whether you're one blood group or another blood group just means here's the shape of the channel that's moving salt in and out, and your shape has to be, you know, this, it has to be one way or another. But if you just didn't have that channel at all, you couldn't move salt in and out of the red cell, and that red cell would just not work. It wouldn't be a red cell. I hope that makes sense. I might try to explain it again once I finish the presentation if people feel that was not a good explanation. Right, I am almost done. So clinical trials. I've told you we're doing this. This is just a phase. When I say we, this is nothing to do with us in Oxford, right? By the way, I'm not trying to take any credit for this. This is all done between Cambridge and Bristol. So what we're looking at here is this phase 1 study, and that's a safety study, and it's done with very few people. In this case, we said 12 people. And as I said, all the preclinical work has led to that, has been, you know, decades of work of scientific studies, laboratory studies, some animal studies. If the safety goes through, it's safe. People are not having bad reactions to the lab-grown red cells, and it looks like it's going to be useful because those red cells are going to last longer. Boom, we will move to a phase 2 where we're going to study more people, 100 to 300 people. And here we're going to see whether statistically it's starting to look like it works. Okay. And then from that, once that's done, we move to phase 3, which is usually thousands of people. This is usually multi-center. So we might have some in the States, some in Europe, some in UK, and we'll say, right, now we're really gonna be comparing these lab-grown red cells, a whole unit, and we're gonna be saying once every 3 months for those people, and then compared to once a month for the people having normal transfusions. And we're going to measure all sorts of things: how people feel, how their hemoglobin reacts, how much chelation they need, etc. And then once that's approved, now I've put a caveat in. Oh, my caveat is later. Yeah, so it's a randomized controlled trial where we've got our patients, we've got our treatment group. So that would be people having the lab-grown red cells, our control group, which is people having normal blood donor, just normal donations. Then we follow them up, and then we compare the results, and these results have to be statistically significant. And then here's my caveat: we've got NICE saying it doesn't just need to be statistically significant, it's got to be cost effective. Okay. And then, so that's my final slide before we move on to Matt. This is great news, okay? I'm not denying it, but I just want people to be realistic and to see that we can't be holding our breath on this because there's still a lot of work to come. Right. On to Matt. So I'm gonna let Matt talk, obviously, but Matt's got a few questions to ask you guys, and we're gonna do this on Mentimeter. So I thought we'd do a little practice.
Before you go on to this, can I just break this up by saying, so Matt is an NHS doctor. He's not affiliated with any pharmaceutical companies or anything. This research is completely hospital based. So I just wanted to say that little disclosure, because when we talk about research, a lot of the time we talk about pharmaceutical companies. Yes. Matt is not. He's an NHS doctor. And I just wanted to say that. So thank you very much, Matt. He's quite new to the thalassemia community and family.
So
thank you, Roanna. I guess so just while everyone's getting to grips with Mentimeter, I'll explain a little bit about me. I'm a haematology registrar. I work in the NHS in Oxford, and I combine my time with clinical work and research. And I have some slides on the project I'm trying to get off the ground, but it's essentially about trying to maximize the benefit that people get from transfusions that we already have. So we've already heard about the great news of new treatments and new red cells that we can use. But the caveat to that is that there's lots of work to be done in that front. How can we improve what we already have? And I think, as Roanna mentioned at the beginning, improving quality of life, because the main aim of the treatment we give people with thalassemia is to allow them to go about their lives as normally as possible, and a big part of that is having a good quality of life. And yet we don't measure very effectively people's quality of life when we're deciding whether you need a transfusion or not. And I'm sure many of you have experienced, if you're on a regular transfusion program, it's not always on that regular program that you require the transfusions at those intervals. It may be sooner, it may be later. A lot of people say that they have difficulty accessing the transfusions when they need it if it's not on the schedule that's been set out. So I think I'm very aware of that, and what I want to do is try and improve how we can use it to improve people's quality of life. I think we've got 26, Roanna, so I'll give it a bit more time for people to.
Yeah, and Matt, I just wanted to say, everybody, so Menti is a program. Some of you might be familiar, some may not. You have to type menti.com into Google, and then that code that Matt has supplied on the top, you type that in, and then you'll be able to vote. So we know we have lots more people on this call, so we're waiting on you.
And it's all anonymous, okay? So we don't know who said what, so yeah. Matt, shall I go to the next slide and then people can...
Oh yeah, I mean, maybe shall I chat a bit about the study while people are doing that, and then explain sort of why we're doing the questions. So one of the areas of interest that I want to do is try to help people who have regular transfusions get the most benefit from them. And the way I want to use that is actually using wearable devices. And what I mean by that is essentially a smartwatch. And I know a lot of patients that we see already use something like a smartwatch, can actually track sort of how active they are and compare that to when they have transfusions. At the moment, the way that we decide whether people need a transfusion or not is using the hemoglobin value. So we do a blood test and we look at the level of red cells in your blood. But we know that that's not a great marker of when people require it. I think is a very safe marker. If it's very low, we know people need it. But often people can be struggling quite a lot with a hemoglobin value that's all right, or they may actually feel quite well and it's come down a bit. And so it doesn't always tell us as well as we might think the best time to give people a transfusion. And the other thing we know is it doesn't correlate very well with people's quality of life. And given that our main aim is to improve people's quality of life, really we should be using that as the definitive marker of what we're doing. And what I hope to do is use activity data, so how active someone is, using the smartwatches to understand if we can give transfusions at a better time, and also remove some of the obstacles that people have to access the transfusion when they need it.
Matt, this is the last slide before your slides, the last question before your slides, and then the rest of the questions will come after. You guys can put in, this is a word cloud, so you can just type in some up to 3 words about what you think are the obstacles. There we go.
Yeah, I think just reading out some of them, sort of no space, needing it on the weekends, being very busy, staff shortages. A lot of the way it was designed sort of a long time ago, looking at hemoglobin levels, and it's about sort of making it as easy as possible to get people to come into the day unit to get blood. And, you know, as times have gone by, that's not really as compatible with you know, the way we live now. And I think we need to have a look at better ways of transfusing patients and offering the transfusions that people need in a way that suits people's lives. Yeah, so family clashes, and yeah, I think a lot of the way that it's looked at is just someone coming in, but you know, there's a lot, it impacts family, work. There's many other aspects that blood transfusions interact with. And so I think it's really vital that we look at all of those and look at it really holistically, rather than just looking at someone's hemoglobin level and deciding yes or no. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the study. I want to say it's in the early stages. I'm trying to get this off the ground at the moment. So I'm trying to apply for funding for time to really start to recruit people into the study. So we're not recruiting anyone at the moment, although we'd plan to sort of within the next year or so. But that's dependent on a few aspects. But yeah, the study, like Noemi has said, has got a nice catchy name, Watch Transfused, which stands for Wearable Technology for Collecting Health Data in the Transfused. Shall I just say next slide, Noemi? So sort of nearly all patients with beta thalassemia major will require red cell transfusions to improve their oxygen carrying capacity, to limit the ill effects of chronic anemia, and ultimately to improve their quality of life. And despite this, like I said, we don't have good data on the best way of giving people bloods. We've traditionally used hemoglobin levels, and we know that doesn't correlate very well with people's quality of life. And it's also not very feasible in people's busy schedules to go and have a blood test constantly in order to check this. So we're limited by sort of good data about what else can we check. And I think part of this is trying to work out, are there other things that correlate with when people need a transfusion? And I'm sure lots of you subjectively, you can feel when you need a transfusion, because there are other ways we can measure this. But it's very difficult to kind of use subjective levels when people have a lot of difficulty getting access to come in and see their doctor and speak to them. So can we use something else to look at when people need a transfusion? And like I said, I think it really needs to be a patient-centered approach. And I think that's why it's really valuable that, I can speak to a group like yourselves at this early stage, to hear what you think, and also to hear if you think something would work or something wouldn't, because it's really valuable to direct research at an early stage, so that we know that what will maximize the benefit for you guys. So like I said, the main aim of the treatment is to improve people's quality of life, and we should therefore be measuring this when we check if our treatment's working or not. And the other thing is the beneficial effects of transfusion, as I'm sure you're aware, are not the same each time. Like I said, people might need them more frequently or less frequently, and it's difficult to know exactly when that will be. And it's not the same every time in the same person, but also different between other people. And so it's important that we individualize care rather than using set values that are the same for everyone. So what's the solution? Well, I'm sure there's lots of solutions, but one of the solutions I'm interested in is can we use smartwatches as a tool to assess the effect of transfusion, and then also use that to personalize when we transfuse people. And the benefits of this is it's non-invasive. We can get the data from the smartwatches, and over time we'll build up a more personalized approach for the individual who's wearing it, to understand, firstly, the benefit that they get from each transfusion, and also trying to pick up when they will require them and the optimal time schedule for that. So what I'd like to do is design a study whereby people will wear a smartwatch, and will be able to get a quantitative measurement of physical activity. So we can essentially get a number. And on a very basic level, I think you could say that's step count. I think there's lots of reasons why step count isn't the best way of measuring it, but it's easy to kind of think about it. As people come to require a transfusion, they'll be able to do less steps each day, and you'll see a trend, and you'll understand at some point someone will need a transfusion, and we can actually pick that up, hopefully before it gets to a state where people are really struggling. We can also explore the differences that transfusions have, and also understand a little bit better about when we give blood, does it have better effects? And I'm sure you'll all be aware, we try to give the youngest blood possible, so less than 10 days old, when we're giving people transfusions. But that's not always possible, and it's difficult to understand the benefit that has in different people, and this will give us a bit more information about that as well. And what I hope to do is generate this initial data so that we can do a much bigger study, and ultimately change the way that we deliver transfusion to people who require frequent transfusions. So rather than sort of having to wait until your hemoglobin's at a low enough level, or until you're feeling really awful and have to struggle to get in and see someone, we can actually have a much more personalized approach to when someone needs a transfusion and give it to them before they get to that point. Whether that's sooner or later, it will be individual and different for each person. What I'd like to say, and Rowan has already mentioned, I'm not sort of affiliated with an industry or a different or a smartwatch product. The data obviously is very personal to people, and that data will be kept secure. It will be safe in an NHS system, and after the study, it will be deleted So it's purely to try and understand whether this is a feasible way of understanding if we can deliver transfusions in a better way. And what I plan to do is initially ask people to just wear the smartwatch for about 2 months, so to encompass 2 transfusions, and then we can actually see the effect that this has had on people's activity. What I was hoping with the Mentimeter is to get an idea of what people already do, if you already use a smartwatch or any apps on your phone, to understand you know, if transfusion affects you, or just to monitor your health and fitness in general. And then what would be really valuable, and it helps me when I'm sort of going to people and saying this is important research to be done, if I have a good understanding of what people already do and how we can maximize that. So that's really helpful for me, but it's also really interesting and really valuable for me to hear what people think and what people do already. There's a couple of questions I can see in the chats. Noemi, does the Mentimeter, does it do one question at a time? So do you have to, yeah. So what I might do is I'll just go through, I'll start answering some of the questions in the chat, and if you don't mind just kind of cycling through the questions as they go. Okay, so the first one I can see is Nasima. What's the age group of the patients involved in the trial? There isn't a specific age group. It will be it's very difficult to do trials in people under 18. So they have to be adults. Just part of the way that trials get off the ground, there's a lot of paperwork that needs to be done. And part of that is that people need to be able to make an informed decision about whether to take part or not. So they have to be over 18, but there's not a maximum age group. Does it come with side effects or risks? The only sort of the only sort of known side effects of wearing the watch . Sorry, I got muted there. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the only side effect really is people can have reactions to wearing the watch. You know, that can be resolved either by sort of, if it's a really bad reaction, taking it off, and you can use creams. But some people are allergic to the type of the silicone that's used in it. The other thing which we mentioned is obviously it generates a lot of data, and that's your personal data. But like I said, that will be kept secure and only used for the purposes of the study. Rana said, one of the issues we face is that sometimes we feel as if our hemoglobin levels are a lot lower than it is reported. Will this be considered? Yeah, I think that's a really important point to say. I think it's often quite difficult. People will say they're really struggling, and then someone will do a blood test and see that their hemoglobin value is, I don't know, say 95. And they'll turn around and be like, well, you shouldn't be struggling because it's 95. And I'm sure a lot of people have sort of been in that position. And certainly speaking to patients, that's something that people struggle with a lot. My answer to that is that, you know, it's part of the problem with the way we do it at the moment is it's very individualized. And so people can feel different with a hemoglobin value, and it doesn't track very well how people are feeling, which is why it's not the best marker to be used to improve someone's quality of life. Like I said, it's very safe, and when it's very low, we know that we need to give someone a transfusion, but it doesn't always track sort of how well you're feeling and how well you go about your day-to-day life. And the issue with that is fatigue, which is really one of the key symptoms of anemia, is a very sort of difficult concept. There's lots of different aspects that come into fatigue, which is not purely just your hemoglobin value. There's lots of other aspects which are very multifaceted and difficult to comprehend, which aren't tracked by your hemoglobin value. And so it's not a very good marker for deciding how well how well you're feeling, and whether your quality of life is optimal, and the need for a transfusion to have your quality of life improved is at that level. So it's not a great marker for deciding when we give transfusion or not. And I think having data of someone's quality of life and their activity levels alongside a hemoglobin level, because obviously people will have their bloods done, will give us a lot more information to kind of really hammer that point home and show that hemoglobin is not a good marker for when people are really struggling and might require a transfusion. Bob has said if we'll use an off-the-shelf device or invent something new. So that's something I've been looking at. My current plan is to go with a research grade device. So that's really an accelerometer. So the benefits of this is it gives us the raw data. The issue with using an off-the-shelf device like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch is that it already generates those outputs like step count and things like that. And to really identify the best metric to measure this, we're probably going to need to look at the raw data, because I don't think step count is going to be the one that works. I mean, just for example, if I told you all that I was going to be watching your step count, and when it got low enough or high enough, we'd decide when to give you a transfusion, I'm sure you'd all, make sure that you were going out and walking enough to warrant the transfusion. So it's not a good way of measuring that. So to really get the raw data, we used to use a research grade device, which will give us that raw data. So that's why one of the questions asked is would you be happy wearing a sort of a dumbed down device, because it won't tell you the time, it won't give you any output, but it will be tracking your physical activity, and then we'll look at it at the end of the study. And I think it's a really valuable way of doing that, because it will give us that raw data to give us the most information possible to understand what the exact metric we need to measure is. Isabel, I've observed a change in my heart rate before and after transfusion on my watch. Yeah, I think that's really important, because it's not just physical activity, it's also your heart rate and also your oxygen saturations. There's a couple of watches I'm looking at, which are research grade devices, so they're not Fitbit or Apple Watch, but also measure heart rate and oxygen saturations. The difficulty with oxygen saturations is the measurement isn't as accurate as it can be when taking it from the wrist, and so that can cause some problems. But heart rate is a really valuable thing, and as speaking to people, to doctors and nurses, when you tell people about heart rate, they understand it instantly. So that's something that that is really valuable in if I was to go and say, look, we can see this and we can see the change in the heart rate, it means that people will understand it straight away, and it won't be as difficult to get into clinical practice. Rosina has asked, is there a trial on this happening already? Is it mainly in the Oxford area? There's a couple of different trials in different conditions where there's a lot of interest in wearable devices and smart technology at the moment to improve how we deliver care. I know there's a study up in Leeds that are looking at people with a type of blood cancer called myeloma, and they're wearing smartwatches. I have had a couple of patients with a different condition called myelodysplastic syndrome who also happen to require frequent transfusions, wear the watch just to see how they've got on with it. It's not purely although both Noemi and I are based in Oxford, you don't need to be based in the Oxford area. I can post out the smartwatch to you anywhere in the UK. So that's not an issue in terms of taking part. Like I said, we're not at the stage where we're recruiting people to the study, because really to get it off the ground, we need to get a bit of support in terms of sort of the funding body to get this through. But the plan is that will happen in the next year, and people can take part from wherever they are. And I've put my email at the end of my slides, which we'll go to at the end. If any of you want to get in contact, I'm more than happy to contact you when we're at that stage. Isabel says, I think you're talking about your hemoglobin. It was 96 last week, and 7 days later was 75. It's hard deciding if I need a transfusion sometimes. Yeah, I think everyone has stories about how sometimes the hemoglobin is a bit of a surprise. People don't expect it to be as high or as low as how they're feeling. And also it changes quite rapidly. And I think, we spoke about when you give blood, when you receive blood, you don't know how old those cells are. Some of them will be 90 days old, some of them will be 10 days old, and obviously they'll last a lot longer. But also there's lots of other aspects that